Hello and welcome to quiz class. Today we have 100 questions on the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So let's get ready to test your knowledge. Question 1. Who became the first American to orbit the Earth in 1962? Neil Armstrong, John Glenn, or Buzz Aldrin? John Glenn. In what year did the Beatles release their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band? 1978, 1967, or 1980? (1967). What was the primary goal of the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion? To stop drug trafficking, to overthrow Fidel Castro, or to establish a U.S. base? To overthrow Fidel Castro. Who succeeded Winston Churchill as Prime Minister of the UK in 1955? Harold Macmillan, Anthony Eden, or Clement Attlee? Anthony Eden. In 1971, which country became the first to legalize same-sex marriage? None, Sweden, or Denmark? None. What environmental conference was held in Stockholm in 1972? No multiple choice here. The United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. Which Soviet leader initiated the policy of de-Stalinization in the 1950s? Brezhnev, Stalin, or Khrushchev? Nikita Khrushchev. What was the name of the American spy plane shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960? The U-2, the Stratofortress, or the Blackbird? The U-2. Which woman won the Nobel Prize in 1979 for humanitarian work? Martin Luther King Jr., Malala Yousafzai, or Mother Teresa? Mother Teresa. What event in the Civil Rights Movement occurred in Selma, Alabama in 1965? The Birmingham Campaign, Selma to Montgomery marches, or March on Washington? Selma to Montgomery marches. Which 1973 Supreme Court decision legalized abortion in the U.S.? Roe v. Wade, Brown v. Board of Education, or Plessy v. Ferguson? Roe v. Wade. In which year did the Cuban Missile Crisis bring the world to the brink of nuclear war? (1962). In 1950, who was the United States President at the start of the Korean War? Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, or John F. Kennedy? Harry Truman. What groundbreaking British rock band was formed in London in 1962? Led Zeppelin, the Rolling Stones, or the Beatles? The Rolling Stones. True or false? Golda Meir was the first female prime minister of Israel. That is true. What was the main subject of Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring? Feminism, the space race, or environmental pollution? Environmental pollution. Which conflict ended in 1975, marking a significant moment in Cold War history? The Vietnam War or the Korean War? The Vietnam War. Who was the French president who helped establish the Fifth Republic in 1958? Charles de Gaulle, François Mitterrand, or Georges Pompidou? Charles de Gaulle. What was the major technological achievement of the Telstar communications satellite launched in 1962? GPS technology, transatlantic television transmission, or internet communication? Transatlantic television transmission. What is the title of the landmark 1973 album by Pink Floyd? The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, or Animals? The Dark Side of the Moon. When was the Treaty of Rome signed? 1965, 1972, or 1957? 1957. Who was the revolutionary leader that came to power in Cuba in 1959? Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, or Raul Castro? Fidel Castro. Which famous music festival took place in 1969, symbolizing the peak of the hippie movement? Monterey Pop, Woodstock, or Altamont? Woodstock. What war did the U.S. increase its involvement in during the 1960s? The Vietnam War, the Korean War, or the Gulf War? The Vietnam War. Question 25. Who first broke the 4-minute mile in 1954? Roger Bannister, Steve Prefontaine, or Sebastian Coe? Roger Bannister. What was the name of the first nuclear-powered submarine launched in 1954? Dreadnought, Nautilus, or Enterprise? The USS Nautilus. In 1974, which U.S. president resigned due to the Watergate scandal? Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon, or Jimmy Carter? Richard Nixon. What major environmental disaster occurred in 1967 involving the oil tanker Torrey Canyon? No multiple choice here. Oil spill. Which amendment abolished poll taxes in federal elections? The 24th, the 22nd, or the 26th Amendment? The 24th Amendment. Question 30. Who was the civil rights leader assassinated in Memphis in 1968? Martin Luther King Jr. What was the major outcome of the 1972 assaults between the US and the Soviet Union? The expansion of NATO, the end of the Vietnam War, or limitation of nuclear weapons? Limitation of nuclear weapons. In which year did the Six-Day War between Israel and its neighboring states take place? 1967. What was the dominant fashion trend among youth in the late 1960s known as mod, short for modulation, modernism, or modernity? Modernism. Which British Prime Minister is associated with the phrase the wings of change or the winds of change in 1960? Winston Churchill, Harold Macmillan, or Margaret Thatcher? Harold Macmillan. What 1970s TV show featured a family band traveling in a colorful bus? The Partridge Family, The Brady Bunch, or The Happy Days? The Partridge Family. What significant legal document did the United Kingdom and Ireland both sign in 1973? The Sunningdale Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement, or the Treaty of Lisbon? The Sunningdale Agreement. Who was the famous American astronaut who said that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind? Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, or John Glenn? Neil Armstrong. In 1955, who led the Montgomery bus boycott? Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., or Malcolm X? Rosa Parks. What was the major theme of the 1970s feminist movement symbolized by the publication of The Female Eunuch? Women's liberation, civil rights, or environmentalism? Women's liberation. Question 40. Who directed the groundbreaking 1972 film, The Godfather? Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, or Steven Spielberg? Francis Ford Coppola. What was the name of the first successful video game released in 1972? Space Invaders or Pong? And Pong is the answer. Who was the heavyweight boxing champion who refused induction into the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War? Mike Tyson, Joe Frazier, or Muhammad Ali? Muhammad Ali. What was the name of the first American satellite launched in 1958? War and Peace, Moby Dick, or Explorer 1? Explorer 1. In 1977, which city experienced a major blackout leading to widespread looting and arson? New York City, Los Angeles, or Chicago? New York City. What U.S. legislation passed in 1964 aimed to end segregation and racial discrimination? The Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, or the Fair Housing Act? The Civil Rights Act. Which novel becoming a feminist classic was published by Sylvia Plath in 1963? The Feminine Mystique, The Bell Jar, or Silent Spring? The Bell Jar. In 1953, who became the first Secretary General of the UN? Dag Hammarskjöld, Trygve Lie, or Hugh Thant? Trygve Lie. During the 1970s, which U.S. president declared, "I am not a crook"? Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, or Jimmy Carter? Richard Nixon. In 1969, which medical procedure was first performed by Dr. Christian Barnard? A kidney transplant, heart transplant, or lung transplant? A heart transplant. Which European city hosted the 1972 Summer Olympics? Munich, Berlin, or Paris? Munich. In 1955, which country became the first in Africa to gain independence from colonial rule post-World War II? Nigeria, Ghana, or Kenya? Ghana. What iconic music festival of 1969 is considered the pinnacle of the counterculture movement? Woodstock, Monterey Pop Festival, or Altamont? Woodstock. Who was the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice who presided over the case Brown versus Board of Education? John Marshall, Earl Warren, or William Rehnquist? Earl Warren. What environmental book by Rachel Carson, published in 1962, documented the adverse effects of pesticides? The Sea Around Us, Silent Spring, or Desert Solitaire? Silent Spring. Question 55. Who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973 for his efforts to negotiate a ceasefire in Vietnam? Henry Kissinger. What controversial policy did the U.S. Supreme Court rule on in Roe v. Wade in 1973? Affirmative action, abortion, or freedom of speech? Abortion. What was the main subject of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962? U.S. missiles in Turkey, Soviet missiles in Cuba, or Bay of Pigs invasion? Soviet missiles in Cuba. Which leader of the Civil Rights Movement was assassinated in 1968? Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, or Fred Hampton? Martin Luther King Jr. What economic organization was established in 1957 by the Treaty of Rome? The European Economic Community, NATO, or the United Nations? The European Economic Community. Question 60. Who was the famous American pop artist known for his depictions of Campbell's soup cans in the 1960s? Roy Lichtenstein, Andy Warhol, or Jasper Johns? Andy Warhol. In what year was the Berlin Wall built, symbolizing the division of East and West Berlin? 1978, 1961, or 1965? 1961. What space mission claimed the lives of 3 astronauts? Columbia, Challenger, or Apollo 1? Apollo 1. Which British Prime Minister is known for his Rivers of Blood speech in 1968? Enoch Powell, Winston Churchill, or Margaret Thatcher? Enoch Powell. What influential theory did British biologist James C. Watson and American biologist Francis Crick propose in 1953? Evolution by natural selection, DNA, or germ theory? The structure of DNA. What 1956 event led to a crisis in the Suez Canal? The Suez Crisis. Which American playwright won a Pulitzer Prize in 1949 but continued to influence theater through the 1950s? Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, or Edward Albee? Arthur Miller. What significant U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1971 allowed the publication of the Pentagon Papers? New York Times versus United States versus Nixon, or Roe v. Wade? New York Times versus United States. What was the name of the U.S.-Soviet summit held in 1972 to ease Cold War tensions? Helsinki Accords, SALT, or Camp David Accords? Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or otherwise SALT. Who became the first woman in space in 1963? Sally Ride, Valentina Tereshkova, or Mae Jemison? Valentina Tereshkova, or Tereshkova. When did Algeria gain independence from France? 1962, 1975, or 1952? 1962. Which legislation did Lyndon B. Johnson sign in 1965? The Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, or Fair Housing Act? The Voting Rights Act. Who was the director of the FBI until his death in 1972? Clyde Tolson, Mark Felt, or J. Edgar Hoover? J. Edgar Hoover. Which famous peace treaty was signed in 1979 between Egypt and Israel? The Camp David Accords, the Oslo Accords, or the Treaty of Versailles? Camp David Accords. What influential music genre emerged in the 1960s as a form of protest? Rock and roll, disco, or folk music? Folk music. In 1958, which 2 automotive companies merged to form the British Motor Corporation? Austin and Morris, Ford and General Motors, or Volkswagen and Porsche? Austin and Morris. Who became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1964? Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, or Mikhail Gorbachev? Leonid Brezhnev. What significant event in 1974 led to the first resignation of a U.S. president? The Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, or the Cuban Missile Crisis? The Watergate scandal. What iconic structure was completed in 1962 in Seattle? The Space Needle, the Empire State Building, or the Eiffel Tower? The Space Needle. Who was the nationalist leader imprisoned in the 1960s? Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, or Jomo Kenyatta? Nelson Mandela. Question 80. What U.S. act was passed in 1972? The Endangered Species Act, Clean Air Act, or the Clean Water Act? The Clean Water Act. When does the U.S. Supreme Court declare state laws establishing separate public schools for Black and white students unconstitutional? 1954, 1965, or 1959? 1954. Which 1976 film about a Philadelphia boxer became a huge success and was followed by a series of sequels? Rocky, Raging Bull, or The Fighter? Rocky. Which American U-2 pilot shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960? Chuck Yeager, Francis Gary Powers, or John Glenn? Francis Gary Powers. He was shot down. What event in live television occurred during the 1969 Apollo 11 moon landing? The Woodstock Music Festival, the inauguration of President Nixon, or the first live broadcast from the moon? The first live broadcast from the moon. Who was the iconic fashion designer responsible for influence in 1950s women's fashion? Coco Chanel, Christian Dior, or Yves Saint Laurent? Christian Dior. Which of the following is a failed military invasion of Cuba in 1961? The Bay of Pigs invasion or the Cuban Missile Crisis? The Bay of Pigs invasion. What was the name given to the first human-made object to land on the moon in 1959? Luna 2. Who led the National Liberation Front during the Algerian War of Independence against France in 1962? Ahmed Ben Bella, Ho Chi Minh, or Nelson Mandela? Ahmed Ben Bella. Which Middle Eastern geopolitical event in 1973 significantly reduced oil production? The Iranian Revolution, Yom Kippur War, or the Gulf War? The Yom Kippur War. Which of the following British bands was formed in 1960? The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, or Led Zeppelin? Led Zeppelin. Which of the following U.S. military operations in Vietnam took place in 1969? My Lai Massacre, the Tet Offensive, or Operation Rolling Thunder? My Lai Massacre. In 1954, who became the first Secretary General of NATO? U Thant, Dwight D. Eisenhower, or Lord Ismay? Lord Ismay. Who received the first heart transplant in 1967? Louis Washkansky, John Doe, or Christian Barnard? Louis Washkansky. Who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his contributions to the Green Revolution? Norman Borlaug, Henry Kissinger, or Martin Luther King Jr.? Norman Borlaug. In what year did the UK vote to join the European Economic Community? 1968, 1955, or 1973? (1973). Which Asian country's conflict with the U.S. ended in 1975? Korea, Vietnam, or Cambodia? Vietnam. Which 1950s TV show featured Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz as a married couple? The Honeymooners, I Love Lucy, or Leave It to Beaver? I Love Lucy. In 1960, which horror film introduced audiences to the Bates Motel? And the answer is Psycho. Who starred as the British Secret Service agent James Bond in the 1962 film Dr. No? Sean Connery. And the last question for today. Which 1970s American sitcom followed the staff of a Mobile Arnold Surgical Hospital? And the answer is MASH. Bonus question. What was the title of the 1970s science fiction film directed by George Lucas? Let us know the answer in the comments and how well you scored. Thanks for playing this quiz. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. See you next time.